Every morning, the world's geopolitical anxiety focuses on a body of water that is, at its narrowest point, 130 kilometers wide, the Taiwan Strait. On one side, mainland China. On the other, Taiwan. And sitting in a control room somewhere in Beijing is a strategic planner who understands something that almost no mainstream coverage of a potential Pacific war ever states plainly. The battle for Taiwan will not be primarily decided in the Pacific. Taiwan is the objective. The Middle East is the battlefield. When military analysts simulate a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, the framing is predictable. Amphibious assault capabilities, semiconductor supply chains, regional stability, U.S. naval deployments in the Philippine Sea, all of that is real. None of it is the main story. The main story is what happens to the Chinese war machine the moment its massive oil lifelines from the Persian Gulf become contested or closed. Because China buys over half of its total oil imports from the Middle East, a massive, vulnerable lifeline of energy that keeps the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese industrial base running at capacities that would otherwise be impossible. Control those distant sea lanes, throttle China's ability to wage war, do it without firing a single shot in the Taiwan Strait. That is the architecture. And once you see it, every piece of Chinese Middle East policy for the last decade reads differently. The standard geopolitical frame for Taiwan is a regional story. Washington versus Beijing, island chains, air defense identification zones, proxy posturing across the Indo-Pacific, the occasional carrier transit as a show of force. That frame is not wrong. It describes the visible surface of the U.S.-China military standoff accurately, but it treats Taiwan as an isolated theater of conflict, when Taiwan is actually the endpoint of a much larger logistical and strategic calculation. There is a region 8,000 kilometers away from that 130-kilometer strait that produces the energy required to run roughly half of the industrial and military capacity that would make an invasion possible. That region is not in the headlines when we talk about Taiwan. It is rarely named in the Pacific Command press conferences, but it is the reason that the Middle East appears in almost every classified Chinese strategic planning document about a Taiwan contingency that has leaked or been declassified in the last 15 years. The story of Taiwan is inseparable from the story of China's Middle Eastern energy dependence. You cannot understand one without understanding the other, and you cannot understand either without first understanding the vast maritime geography that sits at the exact intersection of both. Here is what makes this matter beyond wargaming as an academic subject. A Taiwan conflict is not just a regional security problem. Over half of the world's container fleet and vast amounts of global energy flow through the broader Indo-Pacific corridors connecting the Gulf to Asia. That includes supply chains for European manufacturing, global electronics, and the fundamental inputs for everything from artificial intelligence to consumer goods. Any serious disruption to those sea lanes in a blockade scenario is an inflationary event felt in grocery stores and energy bills in countries that have never heard of Kinmen or Matsu. The geography of global logistics is not an abstraction. It is the physical infrastructure underneath the price of almost everything. There are 3 layers to work through in order. The first is China's actual strategic vulnerability, not as an East Asian military power, but as a geographic pivot point at the far end of the world's most exposed energy supply line. The second is the specific mechanism by which U.S. naval dominance in the Middle East translates into an ultimate deterrent over Taiwan. and why China's aggressive diplomatic push into the Persian Gulf is the direct countermove to that mechanism. And the third is what the current realignment of Middle Eastern powers signals about which phase of this pre-war preparation we are now in. By the time we get to that third layer, the Taiwan Strait is going to look less like an isolated island flashpoint and more like the final domino in a chain that begins in the Arabian Sea. Start with geography, because geography is the one thing that does not change, regardless of who is in power in Taipei, Washington, or Beijing. Draw a map of the globe and trace the route from the oil terminals of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran to the ports of eastern China. That oil must cross the Indian Ocean, funnel through the Strait of Malacca, and navigate the South China Sea. At every single choke point along that 8,000-kilometer journey, the United States Navy and its allies maintain overwhelming maritime superiority. No single geographic reality haunts Beijing more than this. China is simultaneously an aspiring global military hegemon, the world's industrial powerhouse, and the physical captive of a maritime energy corridor controlled by its primary adversary. Before the current era of great power competition, this geography was a managed risk. A globally integrated economy meant keeping sea lanes open served everyone's interests. The looming threat of a Taiwan invasion changes whose interest that geography serves. Everything that has happened in Chinese foreign policy since the pivot to Xi Jinping is, at its structural core, a superpower's attempt to manage the consequences of having its strategic jugular exposed.
There is a set of actors in this picture that almost never appear in the Taiwan conversation, and their absence from the analysis is a significant analytical error. The Gulf Arab states, specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These nations sit at the origin point of China's energy lifeline, rely heavily on the U.S. security architecture, and yet count China as their largest and most important customer. When the prospect of a Pacific conflict is low, the Gulf states balance perfectly, buying U.S. weapons while selling Chinese oil. But in a Taiwan crisis, the Gulf becomes the ultimate pressure valve. Their alignment at any given moment determines whether the U.S. strategy of economically isolating China can be executed cleanly at the source, or whether Beijing's diplomatic leverage keeps the oil flowing regardless of Washington's demands. The Gulf is not a passive bystander in the U.S.-China-Taiwan triangle. It is the origin point. Its willingness to trade oil in yuan or integrate into Chinese technological ecosystems determines whether the distant maritime blockade strategy holds water.
Now to the mechanism, the specific operational logic that connects U.S. dominance in the Middle East to deterrence over Taiwan. In the event of a blockade or invasion of Taiwan, the United States does not necessarily need to defeat the Chinese military in the immediate waters around the island. When a conflict begins, two things happen simultaneously in the broader maritime domain. First, the U.S. and its partners can initiate distant interdiction operations in the Indian Ocean or the Strait of Malacca. The Middle Eastern crude that China depends on to fuel its war machine becomes impossible to move safely. Tankers face insurance embargoes, shipping companies face immediate seizure risk, and the actual logistics of getting Gulf oil to Chinese ports simply stop. Second, the alternative is relying on overland pipelines from Russia or domestic strategic reserves, erasing the sustainable energy foundation required for a protracted war, forcing Beijing onto a ticking clock before its economy seizes up. China's recent diplomatic blitz in the Middle East, culminating in brokering the historic détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, is the explicit counter-architecture to this mechanism. The push structures energy, technology, finance, and security cooperation across a timeline long enough to outlast any individual U.S. administration's pivot to Asia. It commits China to massive infrastructure investment in the Gulf in exchange for guaranteed energy flows. Railways, ports, telecommunications. And it pushes to denominate these transactions in non-dollar currency, which is a direct attempt to insulate the supply chain from U.S. sanctions and financial warfare that operate through the dollar clearing system. The strategic depth of this diplomacy is not accidental. It is designed to make the relationship durable enough that no distant U.S. blockade threat can easily break it. There is a phrase that appears in U.S. strategic planning documents and occasionally in the public statements of defense analysts: the ability to constrain an adversary's strategic options through horizontal escalation. Applied to Taiwan and the Middle East, this means something very specific. The United States does not need to fight a purely defensive war on Taiwan's beaches to impose a catastrophic cost on Chinese aggression. It needs to maintain the credible ability to make the sea lanes from the Persian Gulf contested in a crisis, to signal to Beijing that in a serious confrontation, China's energy supply line runs through a body of water that the U.S. Navy can make dangerous to navigate. This is not a hypothetical threat. China's Navy has been growing rapidly, but it remains a force optimized for the first island chain, with limited blue water capability at the distances required to project power into the Arabian Sea and protect its own tanker routes. China cannot currently escort its own oil imports across the Indian Ocean against a U.S. military that chose to contest that passage. That asymmetry is the leverage. It does not need to be exercised. It only needs to be credible. In every U.S. naval base in the Gulf, every joint patrol in the Indo-Pacific, every strategic bomber deployment that raises the perceived risk on those sea lanes, all of it reinforces the credibility of that leverage without a single shot being fired at a Chinese ship in the Taiwan Strait. That is what horizontal escalation means as a strategic concept. It is not idealism. It is the deliberate use of geography and naval positioning as military coercion at a distance. For global markets, the first-order implication of this structural setup is a permanent, institutionalized linkage between Middle Eastern stability and Pacific security that is not going away, regardless of how individual diplomatic episodes resolve. The U.S.-China-Taiwan triangle creates a baseline level of strategic necessity for Beijing to heavily embed itself in the Middle East that is independent of whether any specific regional conflict erupts. Even in periods of relative calm across the Taiwan Strait, every military planner on Earth is pricing in some probability that the sea lanes connecting the Gulf to Guangdong become contested in a serious U.S.-China confrontation. That geographic vulnerability is embedded in Beijing's grand strategy permanently, and it has been since at least 2010. The second-order implication runs through the Belt and Road Initiative, and specifically through the massive investments China has made in alternative transit routes. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the investments in Myanmar's Kyaukphyu port, the push for pipeline access through Russia and Central Asia to avoid sea lanes entirely. These are not just development initiatives. They are strategic hedges against maritime vulnerability in a Taiwan war. Every dollar China puts into land-based energy transit infrastructure is a dollar spent reducing the leverage that the U.S. holds over China's energy supply. Understanding this reframes the entire Belt and Road as primarily a strategic logistics response to the threat of a distant naval blockade, with the development economics as a secondary justification. India's position in this triangle is the most pivotal, and it is the one that gets the least analytical attention in Taiwan wargaming. India sits geographically dominant over the Indian Ocean sea lanes. India has deep border disputes with China, making its security interests in some ways aligned with U.S. strategic goals of constraining Chinese power projection. But India also heavily relies on Middle Eastern oil, and values its own strategic autonomy, heavily resisting any global disruption that would crash its own economy. In a Taiwan conflict, where the U.S. attempts to sever China's energy lifeline, India's maritime posture becomes the geographic anvil to the American hammer. India's cooperation, or neutrality, is genuinely valuable to both sides in a way that is difficult to reconcile with India's complex balancing act. An unconstrained China shifts the strategic balance in Asia in ways that threaten New Delhi. But a global energy blockade destroys the markets India relies on to grow. India is therefore the one major power whose geography dictates the physical viability of a distant blockade, making it the silent kingmaker in a Pacific war. Pull back from the map for a moment and connect this to something tangible. Millions of barrels of oil moving daily across 8,000 kilometers of water. That volume does not stay in the ships. It moves into the price of semiconductor manufacturing, shipping costs, and ultimately consumer prices across every economy integrated into global supply chains. The Taiwan Strait is not an isolated local story. It is the final tripwire of a massive infrastructure story about the physical system that moves energy from where it comes out of the ground to where it powers the world's factory. When that system is under strategic pressure, when superpowers are actively preparing to contest control over distant choke points as a deterrent against an island invasion, the cost is distributed across the entire global economy, not just the parties to the contest. The specific timing of the current naval deployments, the U.S. deterrence track in the Pacific, and the Chinese countermoves through Middle East diplomacy and Belt and Road investment, all of this is happening simultaneously with a broader restructuring of global trade. Understanding the Middle East as the logistical preamble to a Taiwan war changes how you read Chinese diplomatic visits to Riyadh, Russian pipeline deals, and naval base constructions in the Indian Ocean. These are all signals being emitted by the same underlying structure. Pull these together. China's geography makes its Middle Eastern energy lifeline the single most critical vulnerability in the context of a Taiwan invasion. It sits at the end of an 8,000-kilometer maritime choke point through which its economic lifeblood flows and which China cannot currently protect militarily. It borders Russia to the north and Central Asia to the west, creating land corridors that either complement or undermine the maritime blockade strategy, depending on their capacity. Before the modern era of great power competition, this geography was simply global trade. Today, it creates the core strategic vulnerability in U.S.-China competition that has shaped every major Chinese geopolitical decision since. China's response, its diplomatic integration into the Gulf, the Belt and Road investment in land-based transit, its deep alignment with Russia, is a systematic attempt to reduce dependence on a maritime supply line that runs through U.S. controllable geography. The U.S. response to China's response is the continued maintenance of overwhelming naval superiority across those exact sea lanes and the security architecture that makes relying on those waters a massive, existential risk for Beijing in the event of a war. This is not a conflict with a clear endpoint. It is a structural competition over energy geography that'll run as long as Taiwan remains a flashpoint and China needs oil it cannot produce domestically. The question this leaves open is not just who wins the missile count in the Taiwan Strait in the near term. The U.S. and its allies maintain decisive geographic advantages in the broader maritime domain for at least the next decade. The question is, What happens to the Pacific balance of power if China succeeds in building viable alternative routes and diplomatic shields fast enough that the distant blockade leverage over Chinese behavior meaningfully erodes? And whether the investments currently underway in land-based transit corridors, combined with China's rapid domestic renewable energy build-out, reduce Chinese oil import dependence fast enough to change the strategic calculation in Beijing before a crisis is triggered over Taipei. That is a race with consequences for global security, technological supply chains, and economic stability that reaches every country on Earth. The geography is fixed. Everything else is still in motion.